Hello again. I'm sitting at the loom, and I've been doing a bunch of weaving. You'll see a little bit of what I'm doing in a minute. But what I want to try and do, and this is not going to be easy because it's a mental concept that I had a hard time wrapping my own brain around, and now I'm going to try and explain it to you. And so anyways, here we go. I want to try and explain to you a little bit of how I plan what I'm going to weave. And so to do that, I'm going to move the camera over, and I'm going to grab a piece of paper and a pencil and try and show you some of the thought process that goes into planning something that's being woven. So take a second. I'm going to move the camera and we'll come right back and I'll begin to show you. Alright, so you can see I've just got a blank piece of paper here, and I'm hoping you can see that I've got some what looks like graph paper marks on it, but there's also a white area here that looks like a cross. Okay, so I'm going to start out by doing a concept of just explaining what the various parts of this graph paper are. This top section here, I'll draw a circle around it, represents the warp threads, so that would be these threads going this way on the loom. And it's how I set them up on the loom. Let's move you up just a little bit through these heddles. And I think you've seen that before in my threading. So this is how I plan what I'm going to set them up. So let's come back down again. And let's imagine that I want just a plain weave. So in a plain weave, imagine my fingers. We've got warp thread 1, 2, 3, and 4, and I'm going to go over one, under one, over one, under one. And then the next time around, I'm going to go over and under like that. I'm going to reverse the which ones are up and down. So I plan that by saying that this first row here, the bottom of this little box, represents the shaft closest to me. So I put an X in there, say that's where I'm going to thread through on the first shaft. Then I say the next thread I want to set into a heddle is going to go on shaft number 2. So I put an X in that shaft. I don't know if they're close enough that you can even see this. Okay, then I want to go back and put an X for the first shaft, then an X for the second shaft, then an X for the first shaft, and an X for the second shaft. Now if you'll remember, you've seen it in some of my other videos, underneath I've got some pedals that I can pull, and those raise or lower these shafts. So when I want a pedal, I say, okay, what pedal do I tie to the first shaft in order to raise it up? So when I push down on a pedal, it pulls up on that shaft. So I'm going to go over to this section right there. Now, maybe I'll highlight that a little different. We'll go over to this section, and the pink section there is my tie-up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put an X right here. Okay, and that indicates to me that this column, which represents this column right here, is meaning I'm going to, when I push on that first pedal underneath the loom, it's going to lift up on anything that's in this first row. So it's got this X, and this X. So it's going to lift up threads 1, 3, and 5 from the side of my loom. Then I'm going to put an X here in the second row. And what that says to me, I'll make it a little bit darker. It's now a square box. It says when I push on the second pedal, represented here, it's going to lift up on the second row of threads and that'll be these. Okay, so now if I put an X here to remind myself, when I push on pedal 1, I'm going to lift up on this thread and this thread and this thread. Then if I push on pedal 2, I go up to the tie-up, over to here, and I find I'm going to lift up this thread, and this thread, and this thread. And the next time around, I'll go back to pedal number 1, this one, go up and I lift up threads 1, 3, and 5. Then I do shaft number 2, again, or pedal 2 lifts shaft 2, so it goes up and over. And now I'm going to lift up threads number 2, 4, and 6. Okay, so that's how I design what's called a plain weave, also called a tabby. And if you're not familiar with the concept of how weaving is done, this can get confusing. I fully admit that. It takes a while it took me a while to wrap my brain around this. But it's really a graph drawn in 4 parts. This represents how I set up the loom. This represents which pedals I push. This represents, in pink, how the relationship between the pedals and the strings on the shafts. And then this part down here represents the actual weaving pattern. So the area I'm going to do in red now, that represents my weaving area. And each one of these squares represents one thread in my whole pattern. And if you look down here, I've got 400 and some odd threads going across here. But I can plan it this way, and since there's a repeat every so often, I don't have to lay out every thread of 400. So that's the first thing I'm doing. Now, I use a computer to do this most of the time. The old-fashioned way, just like everything else, is to do it by hand. But let's imagine it first on a computer. So again, here's what I'm doing. This is my planning. And what I've got is the first thread is on shaft number 1. The second is on shaft number 2. Maybe I can make that more visible to you by coloring them in. So I've got shaft number 1, then shaft number 2, then shaft number 1. Then because this pattern's a little bit more complex, I went to shaft number 3. Then 1, then 3, then 1, then 2, then 1, then 2, then 1, then 4, 1, 4, 1, 2. So that's my planning on this one. The next thing I did was say, okay, I want to be able to have a relationship between shaft number 1 or pedal number 1 and pedal number 2 so I can still do tabby. So to do that, I say, let's change colors here. I'm going to say that pedal number 1 ties to the first, to shaft number 1. Pedal number 2 is going to tie to shaft numbers 2, 3, and 4. Now if you look, I've always alternated 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2. I'm always alternating shaft number 1 against all the others. So by doing it this way, I still get the plain tabby that I showed you first when I hand drew this. Okay? So the next thing I do is plan out how I'm going to push the pedals. So first I push 1, then 2, That gets me the row of tabby. The next time around I'm going to tie up number 3. Now number 3, when I do that, I've tied that to shaft numbers 1 and 3. Okay, so I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 2, 1, 2. What that means is, when I get down here, we'll highlight this in pink again. So the first row, when I'm first treadling, first running my pedals, I'm going to push on pedal 1 to get shaft 1, and it is going to raise number 1. Now I've got it set to show as if my warp threads, that's these, are all in white, and I've got it set so that whatever thread is in blue would be my weft threads going this way, blue, and white this way. So when I raise number 1, that means it's going to be up and the weft is going to go underneath of it. When it goes underneath of it, then I see the white thread on top. But it's going to go over shaft number 2, and that means that the blue thread that is my weft is going to show up on the top of the cloth. Then I'm going to go under shaft number 1 again, and I'm going to go over shaft number 3. Okay, and that's going to get this first row. Then row number 2, where I'm pushing on pedal 2, is lifting 2, 3, and 4. Now when I lift 2, 3, and 4, that means that I go under number 2, under number 3. So that means the white is going to show in that place. Okay? Now when I lift number 3, what's going to happen is it's going to lift row 1 and row 3 up. So I go under thread number 1, so it shows white. I go over thread number 2, so it shows blue, because the weft is on top. Over number 1, but in addition to going over number 1, I'm also going over number 3, because I lifted that one with number 1 right here. So that gets me an extra white one on top. Then I do number 2, and I get I use pedal number 3 again, and you can see I've got a long float right here and right here of white threads that are on top. That's how I plan my pattern. Get back to here, and what that gives me in effect is a block of 6 threads together to make a little block. So let's imagine that block like this. Where I've got what looks like a little tic-tac-toe board of 6 threads. Now let's take a look at my actual weaving, and this is going to be really hard for you to see, but we'll zoom in a little bit and come down a little bit. Each one of these little bumps in the weaving here is a block of 6 threads. So that's how I planned out this pattern to show my little blocks. And if I just put one block of 6 threads next to another, it gets this little set of patterns like this. Right here is plain tabby. Right this row is a block. So now you can see that's tabby or plain weave, and then this right here is a set of those little blocks of the threads floating, and that's called Atwater Bronson lace. And that's how I set up this pattern. And all I did was make a bigger pattern for a bigger area by putting multiple little blocks next to each other. So I hope that isn't too confusing to everybody. I know it's not the easiest thing to wrap your brain around the first time you see it. So I wanted to, well, let's back this up. I wanted to try and explain that and hope it makes sense to you. I hope it does. It's how I plan this stuff, and it's how I plan this stuff if my camera doesn't fall, okay, on the tripod. So that's today's little bit about weaving. I'll try and do something like this again as soon as I can, but I wanted to give you a thought on this for a first pass at how I plan out my weaving. If you like my channel, I would certainly appreciate if you would subscribe, and I'll see you again the next time that I come around to get on the camera. Bye-bye.